Today I'm going to be demonstrating a new feature of our HCL Accelerate product. So this feature has to do with our API-driven pipeline applications, which is also somewhat of a new concept itself. So I'll start off by explaining what that means. So an API-driven application is an application that you're going to add to your pipeline in Accelerate, and it's going to allow you to create versions and deployments through our REST API. So basically this means what you can do is you can have applications on your pipeline that you don't even have a plugin for. So if you just have any application, any external tool, and you want to bring into Accelerate, you would create an API-driven application, add it onto your pipeline, and then you can let Accelerate know when there's new versions of your application or when there's been new deployments to different environments. So that's the main idea of API-driven. And what we're going to be talking about today is a new feature of the API-driven pipeline, which is linking existing applications. So we already have plugins that pull in data, and they pull in builds and versions and applications, etc. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be linking to that existing data. So if you create an API-driven pipeline, we can specify an application that already exists in the tool, and we can use the REST API to create new versions or create new deployments of that application. So that's what I'm going to be demonstrating today. So to kind of start off with a little bit of background, what I've done so far is I've created a couple of integrations that we're going to be linking to. So first of all is the GitLab integration I created, and also an HCL launch integration. So we'll start off by delving into the GitLab demo, because as we go on, you're going to see that there's kind of two different ways that we could utilize this new feature that I'm going to explain as we go about. And this GitLab demonstration is going to be the first way we're going to show it. So first, what you're going to want to do when you add your API-driven pipeline, you're going to go into your pipeline as normal, and you're going to click Add App. And you'll see a type here called API-driven, along with all your other types. And these are the two options that I explained. So this is kind of the base model of API-driven. This is when you want to create a brand new application in the tool, when you don't have any plugins or anything importing applications, and you don't have anything to link to. You're just going to create a new one, and that will give you the ability to use our REST API to generate new versions or generate new deployments for that application. And the second option, this is what we're going to be focused more on today, is when we want to use an existing application. So if we have, as you can see here, this first box you're going to have to select is the type of the application, and this is generated by all of the types that are currently in your Accelerate database. So for me, I just have two types. There's HCL Launch and there's GitLab, and I'm going to explain why with GitLab, we don't actually see GitLab show up here. So with plugins like GitLab, you're going to see this other type. And there's a good reason for that. So to explain some, I'm going to have to explain kind of the two different types of plugins we have. So we have a plugin that we can use already to run deployments on the pipeline to different environments. A good example of that is the HCL Launch plugin. For those types of plugins, you're going to see them up here. So let's go to our HCL Launch demonstration to kind of explain what that means. So when I added this application, I went through the main managed by modal, and I selected HCL Launch, and I had an application here. I added it to the pipeline. When done like that, you're able to run deployments directly through the pipeline when that plugin has the ability to do so. So for instance, with HCL Launch, you'll see if I click to add a QA environment, we actually have processes that this HCL Launch plugin imported that we can select, and we have environments that we can select also imported from the plugin. And using that, we can set up the environments in which we can deploy to. And the reason that works when we want to run one of these deployments, for instance, I could deploy 3.0 into QA, is because this HCL Launch plugin has a task to do so. So if I were to open up this deployment template here, I see that we already have this deploy an HCL Launch application. We have a task, we have an integration selected application, everything in there. So when this is run, this task gets run, it's all handled by the plugin. Now, as I mentioned before, not all plugins have that kind of capability. The main example I'm going to be showing you today is the GitLab plugin. So let's go back to our GitLab demonstration. We'll go back to add an application, select API driven, use existing. So any application type that doesn't have that capability, it's going to be displayed under other. So these are all those plugins that don't have a deployment capability. And you'll know they don't have a deployment capability because they're not actually showing up in the managed by column. You couldn't run these deployments separately without an API-driven pipeline. This is the only way you can actually notify Accelerate that a deployment has happened for these types of applications. So we'll select other. And for my example demonstration, I created an application in my GitLab tool just called API-driven demo. So I'm going to select that, and we're going to add that directly to the tool here. Okay, so before we kind of get into running deployments and stuff, first thing you'll notice here is that we already have kind of a version for this application. And that's for the reasons that I mentioned before. And that's kind of one of the main purposes of this linking an API-driven application to an existing application is we get access to all the data that gets imported by that plugin. So the GitLab plugin imported builds and commits and pull requests and the versions, which we're all going to see here, which is why we have the latest version of our application coming from GitLab. And also, if we look at the value stream here, a little bit of a background here. This is something else I set up before the demo. I set up a value stream which just has some simple stages. If you check out this stage, it has just make sure that our pull request has been merged and it doesn't yet have a deployment. And then a stage we're going to kind of explore later on is this dev stage where we do have a deployment now. So these are just two very simple stages that I'm going to show you how we're going to kind of move data along the value stream here. But so far what we have here is everything has been imported by GitLab. This pull request here, you can see we have a pull request imported by GitLab. You see that version that was mentioned already in the pipeline. We see it has been linked to this pull request, and that's how we're going to be able to move the data. So since we have that linking, if we go into the pipeline, what we can do is we can deploy this version, and it will create it will notify Accelerate that there's a version in dev, and it will also kind of move the data. And when I say deploy this version, I use that term somewhat liberally because what we're doing here, we're not actually running deployments in HCL Accelerate. What we're doing is we're notifying Accelerate that a deployment happened. So if you click this pop-up box, you'll notice that before when I did HCL launch, we were selecting an environment and a process to run, etc. When we do this with API driven, all we get here is we get a command, and this is a curl command that's going to hit our REST API that's going to create an API driven deployment. So the idea is basically when run from an external tool such as GitLab, I can say, I'll run my deployment in GitLab, maybe I'll run some tests afterwards, etc. And then I can hit this to say, hey, Accelerate, I've got a new deployment in dev. So that's what we're going to do now. So, and a couple notes about this command here. So the default command we have here works in a Unix compatible shell. This includes POSIX compliant shells like Cygwin or Git Bash. We currently don't have a Windows equivalent. So basically that means this, if you're running this on Windows, you'll have to have Cygwin or Git Bash or anything like that. But most of the occasions we're going to be running this in a Linux shell terminal anyways, especially when run from an orchestration tool like Jenkins. So let's just copy this command, and we will open up just a text editor that we're going to use to paste this in. So the reason I'm pasting this in is we have to add a couple fields here. So you'll notice if you look at this command, you'll see there's a user access key field we have to fill in, there's a version name field, and there's a deployment URL field. So the version name and deployment URL, usually from the tool that's orchestrating this, you're going to have that data that you can specify here, but the user access key is something you're going to have to get from Accelerate. So let's do that first. If you don't know what a user access key is, you can go into your profile here, and you can click, you'll see user access keys, and you can create an access key. I will just call this API. Okay, so then we'll copy this, and we'll go back to our text editor, and we'll just paste it in right here where we needed that. Okay, and then the second field we need is just a version name. And this is something, as I mentioned, we already have from GitLab. You can see this, this version name here. This is the latest version of our application, and this is actually what I want to deploy into dev. So let's paste that in there. Okay, and then also a deployment URL. So I could grab this from GitLab. Again, this is normally going to be orchestrated from a tool such as, we could do this with GitLab, we could do it with Jenkins, but just for this demonstration purposes, I want to show you exactly how to use this API and exactly what's going on. So let's go into GitLab. You can see I have some pipelines that have been built here. I'll just go into the latest one, and I will copy the build. It's basically a deployment in Accelerate terms. So we'll just copy that, and we will paste the URL to that right there. Okay, so now we have our command all ready to go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a terminal, and I'm just going to paste this command in here. You'll notice that this is running against your Velocity server and the specific endpoint we need to create an API-driven deployment. And all the other fields that you need are already filled out, such as the application and the environment. That's all taken directly from the pipeline since we have that data available. So let's run this command. You'll see that it ran successfully. And if we go back into our pipeline here, you'll see that we now have a deployment that was done into dev. So this is how we ran the deployment. This is how we notified Accelerate that we ran a deployment of our GitLab application. And then, as you saw before, I had data already in the value stream. So we noticed that our dot has moved over from merged to dev, and we know what that means. That means that now we have a deployment hooked up to it. So if we look at this dot, we will see that we have this API-driven demo dev deployment requested by API-driven right here. And you'll notice that if I click this, this will take me to that URL that I specified, and that's my deployment. Okay, so that is kind of the main, the first. Well, I'll say that is the first use case of this API-driven application linking feature, and that is again when we have a plugin that doesn't really have deployment capabilities, such as GitLab, for instance, and we can substitute those deployment capabilities by using the API-driven REST API. So kind of the second use case that I'm going to go and show you has to do with when we have a plugin that already can run deployments on the pipeline, such as HCL Launch. That's actually what I'm going to demonstrate. So if we have a plugin that can run deployments, you're going to see it. It's going to look like, again, like this, and you can click to run deployments. But if you want to, you don't have to do it with the pipeline. You can substitute that with an API-driven pipeline. And there's a few reasons you might want to do that. Number one being access control. So you may want to set it up so that your internal orchestration tool, maybe Jenkins or GitLab, you could do it with GitLab, for instance, has all of the access control set up so that you can only run your deployments from that tool, and you don't want to be able to run your deployments directly in your pipeline. You just want to kind of have a sort of a read-only mode here. You would see different versions in here, and you can notify us that you have new versions in different stages and such. Another use case, maybe you might need more fine-grained control of exactly when Accelerate needs to be notified of a new deployment or even a new version. So what I mean basically is if you have an orchestration tool kind of running a deployment, maybe you want to do some validation directly after the deployment happens. You want to run a bunch of tests to make sure that everything went smoothly. and then afterwards you want to hit the API to notify Accelerate, that this version has been validated and it's been deployed into QA. So if you're looking to do that, what I'm going to give a quick demonstration on that. I'm going to use a new application here. If we just click Add App and we select API Driven. So first of all, there's kind of an important distinction to make. Notice when I select API Driven and I select Use Existing, I can select HCL Launch here. This is when we want to manage everything with the API, and we want to use the REST API to tell us when there's versions or there's deployments. When we select Managed by HCL Launch, that's saying we're managing it with the HCL Launch plugin. That's how this app is currently configured. So that means we run deployments using the HCL Launch plugin, using those deployment tasks that I showed you earlier. So for this, we'll select API Driven, we'll select HCL Launch, and we'll just select this wait application, for instance. I'll save it on here. Again, you'll notice that we already have a version. That's, again, coming from the tool. So we do maintain the application versions that are imported from the tool. You can create new versions using the API commands. And you can also notify Accelerate that new deployments have happened to different environments here. So that's kind of the second use case where we're using a plugin that already runs deployments, but we don't want to actually use the plugin to run those deployments. We want to manage everything ourselves, all through the API. So that's a possibility as well. So I went through two different use cases of the new API-driven application linking, and I hope this has been very helpful to you, and thanks for listening. Goodbye.